Why was she the only one who didn't flinch when the explosion shook the ground? The others ducked, instinctively throwing themselves closer to the earth as if dirt could shield them from the shockwave. But she stood, not out of bravery, not out of arrogance, simply because her legs refused to listen. For a heartbeat for two, she was frozen, caught in that strange silence between the boom and the ringing in her ears. Smoke rolled across the valley, swallowing the shape of the horizon, and through it she felt her pulse, not fast, not panicked, but heavy. A drumbeat against ribs that had known too much. She had told herself not to think about him tonight, not when the mission was this delicate. But the mind doesn't obey orders like soldiers do. His face, his crooked grin in the rain before deployment, the warmth of his hand gripping hers at the airfield, slipped through the cracks of discipline. She blinked hard, willing the smoke to take those thoughts with it. "Move," someone shouted. Boots thundered past her. A corporal she barely knew glanced back, eyes wide, waiting for her to follow. She nodded, slow, deliberate, then finally forced her body into motion. One foot, then the other. The moment passed, though the echo of it clung to her skin. The team regrouped against a jagged wall of stone. Their breaths came in staggered bursts. One of them, Rodriguez, the medic, was already checking a soldier's arm, bandaging where shrapnel had grazed skin. He muttered reassurances in a voice too calm for the chaos, a practiced kind of gentleness she had always admired. She wondered, not for the first time, if the weight of every life he tried to save ever sank into him when the night was quiet and the adrenaline gone. She leaned her rifle against the rock, eyes narrowing through the haze. The target compound was still standing, or at least what they could see of it. Half-collapsed walls, a roof torn open by air support that had come too late. Somewhere inside, the reason for this mission still waited. But there was something she hadn't told them, not yet. Her orders were clear: retrieve the intel, confirm the presence of the device, exfil before the local fighters regrouped. On the surface, simple, except missions were never as simple as the briefings made them sound. There were always shadows, always unspoken motives tucked between the lines, and tonight she carried one of those shadows in her chest. The corporal wiped sweat from his brow. Think the strike softened them up enough. She didn't answer right away. The air smelled of burnt metal, of chemicals that didn't belong to the earth. Smoke curled, thick and bitter, coating her throat. She swallowed, scanning the terrain, tracing paths in her mind the way she had 100 times before. Entry points, fallback options, angles of fire. Her silence was not hesitation, it was calculation. Finally she spoke. Softened isn't the same as safe. He nodded grimly. They all knew it. She adjusted the strap of her rifle, feeling the weight settle against her shoulder, grounding her. In that moment she remembered the last letter she had written, words she wasn't sure would ever be read. Folded paper still tucked inside the bottom of her pack, in case tonight didn't let her return. She had written it with trembling hands, not because she feared death, but because she feared leaving something unsaid. A truth she had hidden even from herself until it poured out in ink. The squad began their cautious approach toward the compound. Every step crunched against gravel, a sound too loud in the thick silence of aftermath. The moon cut thin slivers of light across their path, silver against black. She walked at point, leading not because anyone had asked her to, but because she couldn't stand the thought of following someone else's hesitation. Her heartbeat aligned with the rhythm of her boots. Left, right, breath in, breath out. The simple cadence of a soldier who had trained herself to drown out fear with repetition. But tonight the rhythm faltered, because beneath the layers of discipline, the smoke and the gun oil, there was a memory clawing its way to the surface. His voice, the last thing he'd said before boarding that transport: "Promise me you'll come back different." Not alive, not victorious, different. She had laughed it off then, the way soldiers often mask tenderness with bravado. But now, the weight of that word pressed against her chest. Different. He had known something, maybe. Or maybe he had simply seen in her what she couldn't admit, that surviving war doesn't mean you come home whole. A flicker of movement snapped her back. shadows near the compound's edge. She dropped to a crouch, hand raised. The team froze instantly, the kind of instinct that comes from trust forged in fire. She steadied her breathing, finger resting along the rifle's guard, not yet pulling the trigger. The figures shifted again, then disappeared into the ruin. She whispered into Com's voice, low, steady. 2, maybe 3 inside, could be more. A crackle of acknowledgement answered her. Rodriguez shifted beside her, his usual calm now sharpened. Your call. And there it was, the unspoken authority they all deferred to, even when ranks suggested otherwise. She never asked for it, but leadership has a way of finding the ones who carry silence like armor. She signaled forward, and they moved, slow, deliberate. Inside the compound, the world changed. The air was thicker, staler, as though the walls themselves exhaled the memory of violence. Rubble crunched underfoot. A lone light bulb flickered weakly, swinging on a wire that had survived the blast. The corridor narrowed, forcing them into a single file. Every shadow stretched like a threat. She pressed her back against the wall, straining her ears. A drip of water, a shuffle, a breath not belonging to her team. She motioned and 2 soldiers swept forward, clearing the first room. Empty, just dust and overturned furniture and the smell of smoke still clinging to fabric. But she felt it, something waiting deeper inside. Her hand brushed the locket hidden beneath her vest. She never wore jewelry on missions, but this piece was different. Inside, a tiny photo, faded edges, a face smiling in better days. She didn't open it often, superstition maybe, but tonight she felt its presence like a heartbeat pressed against her own. She shook it off, returning focus. Another room cleared, another empty hallway. The suspense grew heavy, almost unbearable. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. One of the younger soldiers muttered under his breath, too soft to catch the words, but she recognized the cadence of a prayer. She didn't stop him. Sometimes prayers were all they had. They reached the final chamber. The door hung broken on its hinges, darkness pooling beyond it. She raised her hand, pausing them. The silence was so complete it roared. Then from inside a sound. Not footsteps, not weapons, a cough, weak, human. Her stomach tightened, civilians, prisoners, or bait. She glanced at Rodriguez. His eyes were steady, waiting for her decision. Every choice weighed heavier when lives dangled on both ends of the scale. She inhaled slowly, exhaled even slower. Then she stepped forward, rifle raised, entering the chamber first. The sight inside froze her. Not enemies, not soldiers. A child, thin, dust-streaked, eyes too old for such a young face. He sat in the corner, knees drawn to his chest, trembling. His gaze met hers, wide and desperate, and in that instant the mission changed. Because now, victory wasn't about intel or devices. It was about humanity. And she knew there was something about this child she couldn't ignore, something that tied to the secret she hadn't yet told her team. She lowered her rifle slowly, her heart beating louder than the silence. How could a child survive here, when men twice her size hadn't walked out alive? The question rippled through her as she held the boy's gaze. His eyes didn't flinch, though his body trembled. Dirt smudged his cheeks. His lips were cracked, his breath shallow, but his stare, it was unbroken. He looked at her the way a drowning soul looks at a fragile piece of driftwood, desperate, yet unsure if it could hold his weight. Behind her, boots shuffled, rifles clicked softly into place. Her team was waiting for the call. Friend or foe, extraction or elimination. The battlefield never left much room for in-between. She raised a hand without looking back. Stand down. The words sliced the tension. No one questioned her. They trusted her instincts, even when instinct looked like madness. The boy coughed again, weak but steady. And then words, not in English, not in any language most of them understood, but she caught it, barely, a phrase she hadn't heard in years, words that pulled her backward into a memory she thought she'd buried. Her throat tightened. She hadn't told anyone, not her superiors, not even Rodriguez, the one person who might have understood. And now here, a child in a ruin whispered the very language that had defined her first mission, the mission that had changed everything. She crouched, lowering herself to his level, rifle slung carefully across her back. Her gloves brushed against the floor, cold stone biting through the fabric. "It's okay," she murmured softly, as though tone alone could build a bridge between them. The boy's eyes darted toward the doorway, then back to her. His lips trembled, forming another word, one she did understand, clear, sharp: trap. Her chest constricted. She didn't have time to think. The flicker of movement came first, shadows peeling from corners, the glint of steel, the click of triggers cocked. Enemies concealed, waiting for the hesitation she had just walked into. The room erupted. Gunfire shattered the silence, walls vibrating as plaster sprayed. She shoved the boy down, pressing him flat against the floor as she spun her rifle forward. The first shot cracked, echoing like thunder in a coffin. One figure dropped. Her team poured fire through the doorway, precise bursts that carved holes into the darkness. Smoke, screams, the sickening thud of bodies hitting stone. She moved like instinct, each breath aligning with the rhythm of her trigger pulls. A step to the left, a pivot, a shot that tore the weapon from another's grip. Her shoulder burned where stone fragments cut through fabric. She ignored it. She had learned long ago that pain was a messenger, not a master. When the last shadow fell, silence rushed back in, deafening. She stayed low, rifle still raised, eyes sweeping the chamber. Dust swirled in frantic circles, refusing to settle. The boy clung to her sleeve now, his small fingers pressing through the fabric. For the first time since she entered, she felt the tremor in her own hands. Rodriguez's voice broke the silence. "Everyone okay?" A chorus of groans, affirmatives, and sharp intakes of breath followed. One soldier cursed under his breath, clutching a bleeding arm. Rodriguez was already moving toward him, his med kit snapping open like clockwork. She looked back at the boy. He hadn't let go. Her team was watching her now, not just for orders, for explanation. They had seen the boy speak, had seen her freeze at words no one else recognized. But she couldn't tell them, not yet. She straightened slowly, guiding the boy to stand. His knees wobbled, his body fragile, but his eyes, those eyes carried something she couldn't ignore. Knowledge, memory, a truth that linked him to her past. The corporal broke the silence first. "Ma'am, what now?" She hesitated, only for a heartbeat. "We take him." A murmur rippled through the squad. Taking civilians wasn't protocol. It complicated everything: exfil, risk, mission scope. But again, no one challenged her. Maybe they knew what she hadn't yet said aloud. Sometimes the mission changes, whether command approves or not. They moved. The compound was not safe anymore, not with enemies lurking in every shadow, not with the boy's warning still echoing in her skull. Trap. The night air hit them sharp and cold as they emerged. The moon was higher now, spilling silver across the valley, revealing every broken wall and charred husk of metal. The smell of burning still clung, heavy and suffocating. The boy stumbled on the gravel. She steadied him without breaking stride. His hand, small and frail, stayed locked around hers. She tried to keep her face impassive, but inside, something stirred. A memory she had tried to bury deep enough to forget. Another boy, another night, another mission. She shook it away, but ghosts don't obey. They follow. The trek back to their temporary outpost was slow, cautious. Every rustle in the brush felt like an ambush. Every gust of wind sounded like whispered threats. The squad spread out, scanning horizons, nerves wound tight. At one point, the youngest soldier, the same one who had prayed earlier, broke the silence. His voice cracked slightly, not from fear, but from something more fragile. "Ma'am, do you think he has family out there, looking for him?" The question pierced deeper than he realized. She didn't answer right away, because she knew sometimes there was no one left to look. Sometimes children were abandoned by more than war. Sometimes survival itself was the only family they had. Finally she spoke, her voice low, almost a whisper. "We'll find out." But even as she said it, she wondered if she believed it. The outpost came into view, barely more than a cluster of sandbags and temporary shelters against the barren stretch of desert. Lights glowed faintly, generators humming. Soldiers at the perimeter stiffened as the squad approached, eyes narrowing when they spotted the boy. Questions would come. Command would want answers. She wasn't ready to give them. Inside, the team dispersed, some collapsing onto cots, others stripping gear with weary hands. Rodriguez finished stitching the wounded soldier, then dropped onto a crate, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. She guided the boy to a corner, offering him a canteen. He sipped cautiously, water spilling down his chin. His eyes never left hers. When Rodriguez finally approached, his expression was gentler than most. "You want to tell me what's going on?" She met his gaze, but the words tangled in her throat. Because to explain the boy, she would have to explain herself, and that meant reopening wounds she had stitched shut long ago. Instead, she said softly, "Not yet." Rodriguez studied her for a long moment, then nodded, though his eyes held questions. He had always been the closest thing to a confidant, but even he didn't know the full story. The story of how she had once been saved by a child's warning, how she had once failed to save one in return, how this mission felt less like chance and more like consequence. The boy finished the water, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and whispered something again in that half-familiar tongue. She froze, because this time she understood every word. And what he said was not a warning, it was a name. Her name. Her chest tightened as if a hand had gripped her lungs. The squad hadn't caught it. They didn't know the language, didn't hear the unmistakable way he formed the syllables. But she heard, and with it came a flood of memories, jagged and sharp. He knew her, or at least he knew of her. And that meant the past she had fought to bury had found her again, here, in the middle of another war. She turned away quickly, hiding the storm behind her eyes. Because she couldn't let them see, not yet. Why would a child know her name when even her own commanders barely spoke it anymore? She didn't sleep. None of them really did, not out here, not with the desert air carrying whispers through the night like ghosts brushing against the canvas of their shelter. But for her, sleep wasn't just elusive, it was dangerous. The boy's voice repeated in her head, those syllables too sharp, too precise to be coincidence. She sat with her rifle across her lap, back pressed against the rough sandbag wall, eyes fixed on the faint glow of the horizon. Dawn was still hours away, but a pale hint of light pressed against the black sky, soft as a bruise. The boy lay curled on a thin blanket nearby, chest rising and falling in shallow, restless breaths. Rodriguez approached quietly, like he always did when he wanted answers without spooking her. He sat down beside her, the weight of his body sinking into the sandbags with a sigh. For a while, he said nothing, just sipped from a dented canteen, staring at the horizon as if he, too, was searching for something he'd never find. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "You recognized it, didn't you?" She didn't respond. "I've known you long enough to tell when something rattles you," he continued. "That boy, the way he looked at you, the way you froze, that wasn't just battlefield instinct. That was personal." Her jaw tightened. She had always respected Rodriguez, trusted him in ways she rarely trusted anyone. But trust didn't mean she owed him the ghost she carried. Still, the silence between them grew too heavy. "He said my name," she whispered. Rodriguez turned to her, eyes narrowing. "What?" In the old tongue, the dialect from the northern provinces. "He said my name, not rank, not call sign, my name." Rodriguez studied her, his gaze sharp but not judgmental. "And you haven't told command." She shook her head slowly. "If I tell them, they'll change the mission, maybe pull us out, maybe bury us deeper. Either way, the boy won't make it out alive." Rodriguez let the words settle. His fingers tapped lightly against the canteen, a nervous rhythm he probably didn't notice. So what's the plan? She exhaled slowly, eyes flicking back to the boy. His small frame, his fragile breaths, the way his hand still clutched the edge of the blanket as though afraid it might be stolen in the night. I don't know yet, but I can't leave him here. Rodriguez nodded once. Not agreement, not dissent, just acknowledgement of a truth too heavy to argue with. The night stretched on. Distant gunfire echoed from somewhere across the valley, muffled by miles but sharp enough to remind them that peace was always temporary. At dawn, Command's voice cracked through their comms, sharp and detached. Status report. She stood, motioning the others to prepare. They reported casualties minor, compound compromised, intel still unconfirmed. Command's response was cold efficiency. Proceed with secondary sweep. Confirm device. Civilian interference not priority. Her chest tightened at the phrase, civilian interference, as if the boy was an inconvenience, not a life. She almost keyed the comm, almost demanded they change the language, but she swallowed it. Arguments over semantics never saved lives. Actions did. When they set out again, the boy followed. Not because they told him to, but because he refused to let go of her hand. The squad exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Their silence was louder than disapproval. It was resignation. The valley stretched wide under morning light, the smoke of last night's strike still hanging low like a bruise across the horizon. The wind cut cold, carrying sand that stung the skin. Her boots crunched against gravel as she led, scanning every ridge, every shadow. The boy stayed close, his steps quick and uneven. Hours passed, the heat rose, tension thickened. Every ruined building they cleared brought nothing but silence and dust. No device, no intel, just ghosts. And then, just when the weight of futility began to press hardest, the boy tugged her sleeve. He pointed, not toward the ruins they had been sweeping, but toward the jagged cliffs beyond. His lips moved, forming words she hadn't heard in years. Hidden below. Her breath caught. The squad gathered uneasy. The corporal frowned. What's he saying? She hesitated only a moment. He says it's underground. The corporal glanced at her, suspicion flickering in his eyes. But he didn't push. Orders were orders, and she was the one they followed when things turned murky. They made their way toward the cliffs, the boy guiding them with small, certain gestures. Each step deeper into the rocks made the air feel heavier, the silence sharper. Finally, they reached a fissure in the stone, narrow, jagged, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The boy pointed again. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't luck, this wasn't chance, he knew. And if he knew, then someone had told him, which meant someone else knew her. The fissure opened into a narrow tunnel, the stench of damp earth mixing with the faint tang of oil and metal. The squad filed in cautiously, rifles raised, flashlights cutting beams through the dark. The sound of dripping water echoed off the stone. Every step deeper made the air colder, heavier. She felt it before she saw it, the hum. Low, almost imperceptible, but growing stronger with each step. And then the tunnel widened, revealing a cavern carved by more than nature. Concrete walls, steel supports, and at the center covered with tarps and cables, something that didn't belong here. Rodriguez let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. The device. Or at least, something close enough to make their orders real. But even as the squad fanned out, documenting, securing, preparing, she kept her eyes on the boy. He wasn't looking at the device. He was looking at her. And in his gaze was something that made her blood run cold. Recognition. He knew more than he'd said, maybe more than he could say. And the question that clawed at her chest was no longer what this device was, but why this boy, out of everyone in this shattered valley, had been waiting for her. Because he had been waiting, she felt it, the way his gaze clung, the way his voice had shaped her name. This wasn't coincidence. It was connection. And connection in war was always dangerous. The world beyond the base gates had become unrecognizable. Where there had once been paved streets, quiet marketplaces, and the chatter of children chasing one another in the dust, now there was smoke, fractured concrete, and a silence broken only by the crackle of fires devouring what had been homes. The air was sharp, not only with the sting of burning fuel and wood, but also with something heavier, a grief that clung to the chest. Isla stood on the rooftop of the half-ruined outpost, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the dark smudges of enemy artillery shells rose in plumes. She had shed blood in this place, shed tears when no one was looking, but she had not shed her resolve. Around her, her squad patched themselves up, reloaded, or slept in jagged intervals, each breath as restless as the ground beneath them. But Isla, she was awake, always awake, watching. "Get some rest," said Karim, her second in command, his voice hoarse as he lowered himself beside her. He was older, his hair touched with gray at the temples, his hands roughened by years of soldiering. "The others follow your lead, but they won't follow you into the grave. You need strength." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll rest when we make it out of here. Until then," she lifted her chin toward the horizon, "they need to know someone's watching over them, someone still standing." Karim studied her profile for a long moment, the way her jaw tightened, the fire burning in her eyes as if it was enough to fuel all of them. Finally, he nodded. "Then let them see you stand." Hours stretched into days, measured not by the rising or setting of the sun, but by the pattern of enemy fire. Mortar shells fell like cruel punctuation, each one tearing open earth and silence alike. Supply lines had been cut. Their water ran thin. Ammunition thinner still. Yet Isla did not let despair take root. Each time a younger soldier faltered, she was there, lifting their chin, placing a rifle in their hands, telling them in a voice like tempered steel, "You are not done yet. Not while I breathe." They called her Al-Noor, the light. It wasn't just because of her presence on the battlefield. It was the way she could sit with a trembling 19-year-old recruit and remind him of his mother's cooking, or coax a smile from a medic who hadn't laughed in weeks. It was how she whispered promises to the wounded that they were not forgotten. One night beneath a blood-red moon, her squad huddled inside the shell of what had been a school. Chalkboards shattered, desks splintered, walls blackened by smoke. The air was thick with dust, but Isla stood at the front of the room as though it were her own classroom, and they were her students in need of something more than orders. "We are not fighting for medals," she told them, her voice carrying steady through the hollowed-out space. "We are not fighting to be remembered in books or etched into stone. We are fighting because the children who once sat in these desks deserve to come back one day. We fight because this soil remembers every step of our ancestors, and it will not forget ours." The silence that followed was heavy, but not with despair, this time with resolve. They sat straighter, their eyes no longer hollow but sharpened, rekindled by her words. 2 days later, the offensive came. The enemy swept through with armored vehicles, their advance relentless. Isla and her squad had been ordered to hold the bridge, a crumbling structure that was the last line keeping tanks from flooding into the city's heart. They knew it was suicide. They knew no reinforcements would arrive. But they did not waver. Under the unforgiving daylight, the battle ignited. Bullets tore the air into ribbons, the ground shaking beneath each explosion. Isla's voice rang above the chaos, sharp and commanding, cutting through the terror like a blade. Karim, left flank, lay suppressive fire. "Lena, get those civilians across the bridge now, move. Hold the line, we do not fall back." Her squad obeyed without hesitation. To follow her orders was to believe in them, even when survival seemed impossible. They fought with a fury born not of hate but of desperate love, for the homes behind them, for the families they refused to abandon. Isla's rifle cracked again and again, every shot precise, her movements fluid, her body an anchor of stability amid the storm. Dust and fire clung to her, but her eyes never lost that burning light. And then disaster. An artillery round struck near the bridge's center. The explosion ripped through concrete and steel, sending a shockwave that hurled men and debris into the river below. The bridge buckled, groaning like a wounded beast. "Fall back," Kareem shouted, but Isla's voice cut through his. "No retreat," she bellowed, dragging herself up from where she'd been thrown. Her ears rang, her side ached, but she forced herself to her feet. Her squad hesitated, torn between fear and loyalty. "If we fall back, they take the city," she cried. "Stand with me." And they did. Even as the bridge crumbled, they anchored themselves to her resolve. Every bullet fired was another heartbeat borrowed against the inevitable. Every scream was swallowed by the thunder of her commands. But resolve alone could not stop steel and fire. Isla's squad was whittled down, one by one. Lena, the young medic, fell with a cry, clutching her side as blood soaked her uniform. Kareem dragged her to cover, his face pale but determined. And then the tanks came. Massive, implacable, their cannons glowing with the promise of annihilation. Isla's breath caught, but only for a second. She looked to the charges strapped beneath the fractured bridge, remnants of their last hope. Her decision was instant. "Kareem," she shouted, tossing him the detonator, "get them out." His eyes widened in horror. "No, Isla." "Now," she commanded, her tone brooking no argument. "You lead them, or this was for nothing." Her squad stared at her, realization dawning, but none dared move. Tears brimmed in Lena's eyes. Kareem's hands shook. "You are the light," Kareem whispered, his voice breaking. "Don't ask us to leave it behind." Isla forced a smile, fierce and unyielding even as fire rained down around them. "The light doesn't die, it passes on. Carry it." And with that, she turned back toward the advancing tanks, her rifle raised, her body a lone figure etched against the smoke and flames. Her squad moved then, because she had ordered it, because to disobey her would be to dishonor everything she stood for. Kareem dragged the wounded across the fractured span, every step haunted by the sight of her silhouette framed in fire. And when the tanks closed in, Isla stood her ground. She fired until her rifle clicked empty, then drew her sidearm. She fought with the last of her strength, her last breath spent not on fear but on defiance. The last thing her squad saw, before the bridge vanished in a roar of fire and steel, was her figure engulfed in light. When the smoke cleared and silence fell, the city still stood. The enemy had been halted, their advance broken on the sacrifice of one woman who refused to bend. And though Isla's body was never found, her name became more than memory. It became a promise, whispered by those who had fought beside her, carried by those who had lived because of her, etched into the very soil she had sworn to protect. They called her the fire in their eyes, because even in death, she had lit a flame that could not be extinguished. The silence that followed her sacrifice was heavier than any explosion. For days, the air above the ruined bridge still carried the acrid scent of fire, and the river below bore fragments of steel and ash like offerings to a merciless god. But within that silence, Isla's name lingered, not as mourning, but as a pulse, steady and unyielding. Kareem had led the survivors back through the narrow streets of the city, his uniform soaked with Lena's blood and his face shadowed by the weight of what he had left behind. Each step away from the bridge felt like betrayal. Each breath borrowed. He had the detonator still in his hand, its edges digging into his palm like a reminder. It should have been me. It should have been us. But her command had been clear. And commands from Isla were not to be questioned. The survivors, barely a dozen from the squad that once stood 50 strong, were gathered in the ruins of an old library. The shelves were splintered, the books turned to ash, yet Kareem insisted they rest there. Something about the place felt sacred, as though the words once housed within these walls still carried a fragment of the world they were trying to save. Lena, pale and weak, clutched Kareem's hand. "She's gone," she whispered, tears cutting through the grime on her cheeks. Kareem didn't answer. His throat was thick with words he couldn't speak. Gone didn't feel right. It felt too final, too absolute. And Isla had never been the kind of fire that simply burned out. "She gave us this," Kareem finally said, lifting the detonator for them to see. "A chance, a city still breathing. If we waste it, then she died for nothing." The soldiers bowed their heads, not in defeat but in solemn agreement. That night word spread. No one knew how the story leapt so quickly through the city, carried in whispers from cellar to cellar, from rooftop to rooftop. But by dawn, the tale of Isla's stand at the bridge had become something more than memory. "She faced the tanks alone," said a child, retelling it to her mother as though she had seen it herself. "They say her eyes glowed like fire," murmured a wounded soldier to his companion. "She bought us a future with her last breath," whispered a teacher as she held her students close in a makeshift shelter. Her story became a spark, and the spark became a flame. By the third day, the people no longer spoke of her death. They spoke of her defiance. They spoke of how she had stood when no one else could, how she had turned despair into steel. Kareem walked among them, his heart torn between grief and pride. Everywhere he went, he saw her face, not in photographs, but in the eyes of those who now carried her fire. He found himself stopped often, strangers pressing hands to his arms, asking, "Were you with her?" Their voices trembled with awe, as though to be near him was to touch the edge of her light. "Yes," he would answer, his voice steady though his chest ached. "I was with her. She stood for all of us." And each time he said it, the fire inside him burned brighter. In the days that followed, resistance hardened. Civilians who once cowered now took up arms. Farmers carried rifles slung across their backs as they carried water to the front lines. Mothers taught their children to run messages through the city, their small legs carrying hope where soldiers could not. And always Isla's name was there. They painted it on walls in black and red, scrawled across the ruins like a vow. "Ayla lives." They whispered it in the dark like a prayer. "Al-Noor, guide us." They shouted it before battle, their voices shaking the air. For Isla. She had become more than a soldier. She was a symbol, a living wound and a burning star. Kareem returned often to the shattered bridge, though there was little left but twisted steel and cracked stone. He would stand at the edge, staring into the river where the wreckage lay, and imagine her silhouette there, rifle raised, unbroken to the end. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Lena joined him, leaning heavily on her crutch. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying the scent of smoke and river water. "She's still here," Lena said quietly, her gaze on the water. "I feel it. Every time I breathe, I feel it." Kareem nodded. "She didn't just fight for us, she became us." Lena looked at him, her eyes bright despite the exhaustion etched into her face. "Then we can't let her down. We have to keep moving, keep fighting." For the first time since the bridge, Kareem smiled, a small, weary smile but real. "We will, for Isla." Weeks passed and still her story grew. The enemy, too, had heard it. Among their ranks, Isla became a ghost, the woman who burned tanks with her gaze, the soldier who defied artillery with nothing but will. Fear crept into their hearts, twisting their orders into hesitation. For who could truly fight against a legend? The resistance used it well. Each skirmish, each ambush, carried her shadow. Her name became the war cry that broke enemy morale, her story the weapon sharper than any blade. But beyond the battlefield, something deeper stirred. The people began to rebuild, not with stone or wood but with belief. Markets reopened in hidden alleys, laughter returned in fragments, and songs once thought lost were sung again, softly at first, then louder. Children who had never seen Isla began to draw her face in chalk on the walls, eyes fierce, hair tied back, rifle in hand. They had no photographs, no statues, but their drawings carried her fire more clearly than any monument ever could. One evening, Karim sat in the dim light of a candle-lit shelter, writing on scraps of salvaged paper. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what he wrote. Her name was Isla. She stood when the world fell. She carried us through fire, through loss, through the silence of despair. She was not a hero because she died. She was a hero because she lived without bending. When he finished, he set the paper down and pressed his hand against it, as if sealing a vow. He knew then what his purpose had become. He was no longer simply a soldier. He was a keeper of her fire. The next morning he gathered the squad, what remained of them, and spoke. "We fight on," he said, his voice low but firm. "But not just with weapons. We fight with her story. Wherever we go, whoever we meet, we carry her name, until even the enemy knows there is no place they can stand where her shadow does not reach." And so they did. They carried Isla into every village, every camp, every whispered breath of resistance. And in return, the people carried her forward, her light, her defiance, her unyielding fire. By the time the next great battle came, the enemy did not face soldiers alone. They faced a people transformed, a people who no longer bowed, who no longer begged for survival, a people who had Isla in their eyes. And as they charged, their voices thundered in unison across the battlefield. "Ayla lives." The words rolled like storm clouds, like the roar of the earth itself. And for the first time, Karim did not feel her absence. He felt her presence, alive in every shout, every heartbeat, every step toward freedom. The light had not been extinguished, it had spread. And the fire in her eyes now burned in them all. The question spread like wildfire across occupied cities, whispered in bunkers and painted on broken walls. Was she truly gone? No one had seen her body, no photographs, no ashes, just the blast, the fire, and the silence that followed. For some, that silence meant death, but for many, perhaps for most, it became something else. Hope. If Isla could vanish into smoke, then maybe she could also walk back out of it. Maybe her fire was waiting unseen in the shadows of another battlefield. The enemy feared this possibility more than any bullet. Soldiers flinched at empty streets, half expecting her figure to emerge with rifle raised. Commanders argued in tense voices late at night, unsure whether they had truly destroyed her or if they had birthed a phantom that would haunt them forever. And in that uncertainty, resistance grew teeth. Karim felt it first in the quiet shift of eyes. When villagers looked at him now, they no longer saw just a soldier, they searched his face for traces of her. "You were with her," they whispered. "You heard her voice. Tell us again." So he did. Night after night in basements and burned-out schools, Karim retold the story. The bridge, the tanks, the detonator. The moment she turned, gave her final order, and chose fire over surrender. Every retelling carried new details, sometimes because his memory sharpened, sometimes because those listening added pieces of their own. The legend began to outgrow the truth. She became larger, brighter, unstoppable. At first, Karim resisted it. She was just human, he wanted to say. She bled, she hurt, she feared. But as faces lit with courage, as trembling hands steadied into fists, he realized the truth no longer mattered. What mattered was what she had given them, a reason to stand. One evening, Lena sat beside him, her legs still bound in a rough brace. She had drawn a map across a piece of cloth, showing roads, enemy checkpoints, supply routes. "They're thinning their patrols here," she said, tapping the cloth with her finger. "They don't trust their own men anymore. Rumors about Isla have made them paranoid." Karim stared at the map, then at her. "Paranoid soldiers make mistakes." Lena nodded. "And mistakes give us openings." Her voice carried weight, but her eyes betrayed something softer, fear. "But Karim," she whispered, "how long can we keep using her name like this? What if it breaks under the weight we're putting on it?" Karim placed his hand over hers. Her name doesn't break, it carries. But even as he said it, he wondered. Would the day come when people remembered not Isla's courage but only the legend? And if that day came, would the woman he had known, flesh and blood, laughter and tears, be lost beneath the myth? The resistance moved in silence through forests and crumbling villages. Every time they struck, they left behind her name painted in defiance. Ayla lives. The enemy tried to erase it. They sent squads to scrub the walls, to tear down the cloth banners strung between ruins. But for every mark they removed, 10 more appeared by dawn. Even enemy soldiers began whispering it among themselves. Some laughed nervously, dismissing it as propaganda. Others carried the fear in their eyes like a shadow they couldn't shake. Reports leaked through their command. An ambush abandoned because men refused to march through a bridge haunted by Isla. A supply line rerouted because soldiers swore they heard her voice in the wind. The more they tried to kill her, the more alive she became. One night, Karim and his squad lay in ambush along a supply road. The moon was thin, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. The convoy came slowly, headlights cutting beams across the broken road. Karim raised his hand to signal, but before he could give the order, one of the enemy trucks stopped. A soldier climbed out, rifle slung carelessly. He walked into the darkness, muttering. Lena, watching through her scope, whispered, "He's saying her name." Karim froze. "What?" "He's muttering it, Isla, over and over." The soldier stopped in the middle of the road, staring into the trees. Then, with trembling hands, he laid down his weapon. He lifted his arms high and shouted in a broken voice, "I will not fight her ghost." Chaos rippled through the convoy. Orders barked, men shouting, some refusing to move forward. And in that moment of confusion, Karim's squad struck, swift and sharp. When the smoke cleared, the resistance had taken not just supplies, but something greater. Proof. Proof that even the enemies could be cracked open by her shadow. In the weeks that followed, her story began to travel farther, across borders, across mountains, across seas. Refugees carried it in fragments, weaving it into new lands like threads of fire. Foreign voices whispered her name with reverence. Some didn't even know if she was real, but they wanted her to be. Songs emerged, low and mournful at first, then louder, fiercer. Children chanted her name in rhythm as they played. Old men spoke of her with the same weight they once gave to prophets. And yet, amidst all this, Karim found himself haunted. At night, when silence wrapped around the camp, he saw her again. Not the legend, not the warrior etched in murals, but the woman he had known. Her tired smile after long marches. The way she traced invisible lines on her rifle when she couldn't sleep. The softness in her eyes when she spoke of home. He feared those memories would fade, drowned beneath the roar of her myth. But then he realized something. The myth was not replacing her. It was amplifying her. She had become what she had always been destined to be, the echo of her people's survival. Still, questions lingered. One evening, after a long march, Lena sat close to Karim, the firelight painting shadows across her face. "Do you think she knew this would happen?" she asked. "That she'd become more than just herself?" Karim stared into the flames. "Maybe, but I don't think it mattered to her. She didn't stand at that bridge for glory. She did it because she couldn't do otherwise, because she carried us even when we didn't believe we could carry ourselves." Lena's voice softened, "And now she carries the world." They fell into silence, listening to the fire crackle. Beyond the camp, the forest whispered with wind, and for a moment Karim thought he heard it, her voice faint but steady, "Keep walking." The enemy command convened in desperation. Their maps were littered with red marks of failed offensives. Reports piled high of villages rising, soldiers defecting, morale collapsing. And in the center of it all, a name that refused to die: Isla. "She is a ghost," one general spat. "How do we fight a ghost?" "You can't," another replied grimly. You can only hope the people stop believing. But belief is harder to kill than flesh, and Isla's belief had already taken root in too many hearts. Karim knew a reckoning was coming, a battle larger than the bridge. The enemy would throw everything they had to crush the resistance once and for all. And when that day came, it wouldn't just be soldiers standing against them. It would be the echo of Isla's name, roaring like thunder through every voice, every step, every strike. One night, as Karim lay awake beneath the fractured stars, he whispered into the dark, "You're still with us, aren't you?" The silence held steady, and then faintly the wind stirred. He closed his eyes, and in that silence he felt her answer, not in words, but in the unbreakable fire that still burned in his chest. She had never left. The first shot came at dawn, not from the resistance, but from the enemy, a sudden thunder of artillery that tore through the earth like an angry god. The city shook, walls collapsed, children screamed, and still amidst the chaos the cry rose again, "Isla lives." It was no longer just a phrase. It was a shield, a weapon, a defiance stronger than concrete or steel. For every shell that fell, for every fire that roared through the streets, the people shouted louder, as if their voices alone could hold back destruction. But Karim knew. The enemy wasn't here to win ground. They were here to kill belief, to stamp out the ghost they themselves had created. They weren't just fighting a war anymore. They were fighting Isla. The resistance scrambled through smoke and ruin, rallying where they could. Lena, still limping but relentless, barked orders with the precision of someone who had learned command not by choice but by survival. "They'll push hardest where they think we'll break," she told Karim, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. "The bridges, the supply lines, the heart of the city." Karim nodded, his jaw set. "Then that's where we'll stand." But standing would not be enough. He looked around at the faces of the survivors, young, scarred, trembling but fierce. Some had rifles. Others carried only knives, rocks, or nothing at all but their voices. And yet when he spoke Isla's name, their spines straightened, their fear hardened into resolve. "She fought alone once," Karim said. "We don't let her fight alone again." The battle stretched into days. Streets turned into graveyards, buildings into barricades. Smoke blotted out the sun, casting the city into an endless twilight of gunfire and shadows. At night, when silence dared to settle, Karim heard it, the hum of voices across the ruins. Civilians singing softly, their words weaving her name into every note. A lullaby for the fighters, a dagger for the enemy. Isla was everywhere. On painted walls, in whispered prayers, in the steady eyes of children carrying water to the front lines. The enemy had thought to bury her. Instead, they had unearthed her in every heart. One evening, as Karim leaned against the shattered wall of a factory, Lena approached. Her hands were shaking, not from fear but from something deeper, something unspoken. "They've surrounded us," she said quietly. "Two divisions, tanks, aircraft. They mean to crush us here, to end it once and for all." Karim closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing into his chest. He thought of Isla, how she had stood at her bridge, knowing the odds, knowing the outcome. Was this their bridge now? Lena's voice cracked. "Karim, what if this time belief isn't enough?" He opened his eyes and met hers. Belief was never enough on its own, but it makes us act. It makes us refuse to bow. And sometimes that's the only weapon left. She nodded, tears streaking her face, but her shoulders squared. "Then we stand." The enemy came at dawn again, their engines roaring like a storm. Columns of armor rolled through the smoke, soldiers advancing in waves. And yet as they pressed forward, a sound rose to meet them. Not gunfire, not explosions. Voices, thousands of them. From rooftops, from shattered windows, from alleyways and barricades, the city roared as one. "Ayla lives." The cry shook the air, drowning out the engines, rattling even the steel hearts of the tanks. The enemy fired anyway, shells tearing through buildings, machine guns cutting into stone. But the cry did not stop. Even when voices fell silent in death, others rose to replace them. It was no longer a battle cry, it was an anthem. Karim led his squad through the wreckage, striking where they could, retreating where they must. He moved like a man possessed, Isla's memory blazing in every step. At one point, they cornered a group of enemy soldiers in the ruins of a school. One raised his hands, dropping his weapon, eyes wide. "Please," the soldier begged, "don't kill me. I've heard her voice. I've felt her watching. I can't fight her anymore." Karim stared at him, torn between rage and pity. Then slowly he lowered his rifle. "Go," he said, "tell your commanders the truth. You're not fighting us, you're fighting her, and she doesn't die." The soldier fled, stumbling into the smoke. Lena gave Karim a questioning look. "We don't need more dead," Karim said softly. "We need more believers." By the fifth day, the city was unrecognizable, but still it held. The enemy's momentum faltered, their soldiers exhausted, their morale fractured by a ghost they could not kill. And yet Karim knew this could not last. Ammunition was running low. Food was scarce. They were bleeding, and the enemy had endless reserves. That night, as fires lit the skyline, Karim stood on the roof of a ruined hospital and looked out over the city. For a moment, in the glow of the flames, he saw her. Isla, standing in the smoke, rifle slung across her back, eyes steady, unbroken. He blinked and she was gone, but the fire in his chest remained. He whispered into the night, "Guide us, one last time." The next morning, Karim gathered the survivors. Not just soldiers, but civilians, children, elders, anyone who could stand. "This is our bridge," he told them, his voice carrying across the ruins. "This city is the line. If we fall here, we fall everywhere. But if we hold, if we make them bleed for every step, then Isla's fire spreads farther, beyond these walls, beyond this land, into the world." He paused, looking at their faces, tired, scarred, but burning with something greater than fear. They came to kill her ghost. Instead, they found her in all of us. And with that, they raised their voices once more, a single cry rolling like thunder across the ruins. "Ayala lives." The enemy struck with everything they had. Bombs rained, tanks roared, soldiers swarmed. The city groaned beneath the weight of destruction. But the resistance did not bend. Every street became a barricade, every ruined wall a fortress, every survivor a soldier. And in every heartbeat, Isla was there. In the woman who shielded children with her body. In the boy who carried messages through fire. In the old man who picked up a rifle for the first time in decades. The enemy had thought to end her here. Instead, they multiplied her 1,000-fold. As night fell, Karim found himself in the heart of the fight, his rifle empty, his body bruised and bloodied. Around him, the city burned, but the anthem still rose unbroken. Isla lives. And for the first time, he understood. She had never been just one person. She had been a spark. And sparks don't die, they spread. He lifted his voice, raw and ragged, and joined the cry. "Ayala lives." The words tore from his throat, echoed by thousands more, until even the enemy hesitated, their will collapsing beneath the weight of a name they could not silence. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the scent of ash and wet earth. She walked through the ruins slowly, each step measured, her boots pressing into mud that swallowed sound. Around her, the silence wasn't empty. It was thick, carrying voices that no one else would ever hear. Some might have seen just rubble, but she saw names carved into every stone, echoes in every broken window, breaths caught in the dust. And she carried those echoes like medals on her chest, even though no one would pin them there. Why had she survived when others hadn't? That question stayed with her, haunting the edges of her reflection. The war was over, or at least this battle was, but endings never arrived with fanfare, not for her. They came in hushed tones, in smoke that refused to clear, in eyes of strangers who would never know what had been paid for their peace. She paused at what remained of a doorframe, running her fingers across the charred wood. She remembered knocking on another door long ago when she was just a recruit. Her father had stood there, proud but worried, a folded letter in his hand with her name printed sharply at the top. "Are you sure?" he had asked. She hadn't been, but she'd gone anyway. She hadn't known that one choice would chain her to a lifetime of nights like this, wandering through aftermaths, counting names the world would never speak again. Behind her, one of the younger soldiers approached. He hesitated before speaking, his voice trembling, almost embarrassed by its own existence in that space. "Ma'am, the trucks are ready. They're waiting for you." She turned slowly. His face was too young for what he had just seen, too unlined for the weight his shoulders now carried. He avoided her eyes, staring at the ground instead as though ashamed of his survival. She recognized that look. She had worn it once, maybe still wore it. "Take them in," she said softly. "I'll follow." He nodded and left, his boots splashing in shallow puddles. She waited until he was gone before letting her shoulders sag. She had learned long ago that leadership meant carrying what others couldn't, and often it meant hiding what you felt most. The wind stirred, carrying with it the faint crack of wood breaking somewhere deep within the wreckage. She looked toward it, instinctively reaching for the weapon slung across her back. For a moment she thought of pursuit, of confirming what she had heard. But then she stopped. Not every sound was an enemy. Sometimes it was just the earth shifting under the weight of what had been lost. Still, the old habit stayed alive, as though war had carved reflexes into her bones. As she walked toward the convoy, her mind slipped back to the mission's beginning. The faces of those who hadn't made it home appeared with every step. She could still hear Harris joking about coffee, still see Vega tracing the small tattoo on her wrist, a quiet prayer she never spoke aloud. They weren't names on a report to her. They were voices that would never fade. And she carried them now, as much as the gear on her back. At the trucks, the men watched her approach. No one said anything, but their silence carried weight, an acknowledgement of her, of the path she had walked, of the smoke she had emerged from. They didn't know how to name it, and maybe it didn't need naming. Sometimes survival itself was the anthem. The engines rumbled to life, coughing out black smoke into a sky still veined with gray. As they began to move, she sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She thought about the promise she had made to her brother years ago when he had shipped out before her. "I'll come back," she had said. He hadn't. And so every time she returned, she felt both the weight of keeping her word and the guilt of breaking his. The road stretched on, endless and uncertain. She leaned her head back, closing her eyes, feeling the vibration of the truck beneath her. It wasn't comfort, but it was motion. And sometimes, motion was enough to keep grief from hardening into stone. No one asked her how she felt. They never did. Maybe they assumed strength came without cracks. Maybe they were afraid to know the truth. But inside, she wasn't unbreakable. She was human, tired, bruised in places no medic could reach. And yet she kept moving, because movement meant choice, and choice meant life. Hours later, when they reached the base, she stepped out before anyone else. The sun was rising, painting the world in a soft, golden hue that felt almost cruel against the memories of the night. She watched it for a long time, her face expressionless but her chest aching with a quiet storm. One of the men came to her side, hesitant, carrying a flask. "Coffee?" he asked. She almost smiled. Almost. "Thanks," she whispered, accepting it. The warmth against her palms felt like something sacred, a reminder that even after smoke and silence, small comforts could still exist. They stood there together, not speaking. The dawn unfolded before them, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, without the weight of orders or survival pressing against her lungs. She knew tomorrow would come with new battles, maybe in deserts, maybe in cities, maybe only inside herself. But today, she allowed the silence to linger, allowed the golden light to touch her scars without shame. Because scars weren't endings. They were verses, proof that something had been endured, that something had been written into flesh and memory. And so, when she finally turned to walk back toward the barracks, she didn't need words. She didn't need recognition. She had already declared her victory with every step through smoke and silence. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.